¿Alguien quiere comenzar con su primera pregunta? Por favor, levante la mano o envíame un mensaje por el chat. Vale. Job is going to start with the first question. Job, go ahead.
Hi. Hello, Dr. Craig. Can you hear me well?
I can.
Okay. Yes. My first question is more like a theological question. Because here in Latin America, it is becoming popular, or it's growing, a theological position that opposes to the use of arguments or scientific proofs for the existence of God. They say that we cannot do that because God is not an object in space and time, and therefore we cannot adduce scientific proofs for his existence. So reason is far away from God, right? So there is this objection within Christianity, right? So what do you think about this theological position?
Yes. Before I address the question, let me just say to all of you how appreciative I am of the work that you're doing with Reasonable Faith throughout Latin America. You folks are really our hands and feet on the ground, in contact with real people and impacting their lives personally. And we are so grateful for what you're doing. And I have to say, as I reviewed some of the questions Raul sent me, it reminded me of my statement that if a person will master the contents of On Guard, my book, he will be able to answer 95% of the questions that people have. And as I looked at these questions, I thought, these chapter directors belong to the other 5%. These are extremely interesting and sophisticated questions that you put to me today, and I hope to address at least most of them adequately. Now, with respect to the question you just asked, ironically, I think that Thomas Aquinas, all the way back in the 13th century, answered that question perfectly adequately. Aquinas said that we do not have a direct and immediate knowledge of God, but he says that we can infer God's existence from his effects. And so Aquinas would reason from things like change, contingency, moral values, complexity, and function back to God as the ultimate source of things like design, contingent existence, causality, and so forth. And it seems to me that Thomas's argument or his position is absolutely correct. Now, I would also say that this kind of general objection, this sort of sweeping dismissal of theistic arguments, just becomes irrelevant when you present the person with a specific argument. Confronted with a specific argument, it doesn't do any good to talk in generalities anymore. He has to show you which premise he regards as false and why. So these kinds of generalizations, I think, are not very impressive, because once you have an actual argument in front of you on the table, then you've got to deal with the premises of those arguments and can no longer talk in generalities.
Thank you very much.
Any follow-up, Hope, or should we go to the next question?
No, it is clear. Thank you.
Okay. Luis Vasquez, I know you want to do another question as well.
All right. Raul, the clarity of the audio transmission was such that I couldn't understand what the questioner was asking. Can you repeat his question for me in a very succinct way?
Yes, of course. I have it here, actually. It's, given that the Kalam cosmological argument deals with the origin of the universe, what objection or response can we offer against those schools of thought that although they do not reject the principle of causality, they avoid making ontological claims about origin. And he gives examples like object-oriented ontology on metaphysics.
Yeah, I noticed one of the other questions mentioned this so-called object-oriented ontology, and I have to confess, I'm not familiar with that. I've just never even heard of it. But again, I would say that once you present an argument to someone, he has to identify which premise he thinks is false and why. So with regard to the Kalam argument, you already said that he doesn't disagree with the principle of causality, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And if he doesn't disagree with the second premise, that the universe has a beginning, then it follows logically, necessarily, that the universe has a cause. So unless he has some reason to dispute the truth of one of those premises, it seems to me that he's stuck with the conclusion.
Okay, I'm gonna read one of the questions that somebody sent that is not that didn't connect today. What do you think about Alexander Spruce's argument against simultaneous or instantaneous causation that he postulates with his judge analogy? So Alexander Spruce gives this analogy of a judge against causation, and he says this: suppose that instantaneous causation is possible, then the following are composable characters: a judge who instantaneously stamps death warrants, and the executioner who executes the person listed on the warrant in such a way that the very instant that the death warrant is stamped, the person is dead. Moreover, the executioner takes no orders from dead people. She only executes people if the judge was alive at the instant the warrant was stamped, and she executes no one else. There is no metaphysical absurdity if the judge stamps a warrant for your death. There's merely an injustice. But what if the judge stamps a warrant for his own death? Then instantaneously the executioner executes the judge. But then the judge wasn't alive to stamp the warrant as if he stamped posthumously. Then that doesn't count. But with no warrant stamped, the executioner didn't do anything. And so the judge both is and is not executed, which is absurd.
Yeah. I've never encountered this paradox before, but just reacting off the top of my head, what jumps out at me is that this is not an argument against simultaneous causation. It's an argument against instantaneous causation. And there's a huge difference there. He's arguing that causation isn't at an instant. Now, I don't even believe that instants exist, and certainly no sort of process or event takes place at an instant. So, for example, killing someone is not instantaneous. It always takes time, even if it's just a few seconds. And so I'm untroubled by this argument against things occurring at an instant. I think we can accept with equanimity the idea that instantaneous causation doesn't occur, and yet still accept the idea that simultaneous causation occurs. For example, that two events happen in the same second or in the same half second or something of that sort. But we don't need to be committed to saying that cause and effect are instantaneous.
Other than the death analogy of instantaneous and simultaneous causation, is there another maybe another example that you could give, so to clarify the difference between instantaneous?
Well,
Simultaneous?
instantaneous means that it takes place in zero time. An instant is a point. It's like a geometrical point, except it's a point of time. It has literally zero duration. And so no sort of event, no sort of change can take place in an instant because it literally has zero duration. So to give an example, when does someone win a race? Well, he wins the race when he crosses the finish line. And that will always take some amount of time. It's not in an instant that you cross the line. So these are examples of ancient Greek paradoxes that are called Sorites paradoxes, which have to do with infinite divisibility and composition. For example, when does someone leave the store? Well, there isn't any instant at which a person leaves the store, because in that instant, he's either not crossed the threshold, in which case he's still in the store, or if he has crossed the threshold, he's already left the store. So it's impossible to find an instant at which a person leaves the store. It will always be an interval of time that has some finite value.
Let's go with Saulo. I know he wants to make a question, and then Hub wants to do another question.
Yes.
Hi, Dr. Craig.
Hi.
It's very nice to meet you here at Zoom. It's the only way. So I believe my question to you is kind of like more like can you summarize exactly how is the B theory of time incompatible with the Kalam cosmological argument? Because as I understand your thoughts, your material, you're always arguing pro the A theory of time. But
Yes.
I have seen someone else, I don't remember quite well right now, that has argued for a theistic position using B theory of time, making some sort of a Kalam cosmological argument using B theory of time.
Right.
What is exactly your thoughts on this? Because
Okay.
for me, it seems like just as you have just said, there is not such thing as a instant with a zero duration of time. I mean, the minimum amount of time is the Planck time. So any event in this universe has a minimal duration of a Planck time. So how can the B theory of time be used to a Kalam argument?
All right. The B theory of time, for those of you who are not familiar with it, says that the difference between past, present, and future is just a subjective illusion of human consciousness. In fact, all moments in time, past, present, and future, are equally real, and there is no temporal becoming. Things do not really come into being and go out of being. So that would be what the B theory of time holds. Now, in my view, there's no incompatibility between the B theory of time and the second premise of the Kalam argument that the universe began to exist. Quite the contrary. In fact, I'd say probably most physical cosmologists at least work with a B theory of time and believe that space-time had an absolute beginning in the Big Bang. But I think that the truth of the first premise, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, becomes nearly inescapable if you have an A theory of time. Because on an A theory of time, things literally come into existence. Before they begin to be, they did not exist. They come into being. And it seems to me just inconceivable that something could come into being without a cause. By contrast, on the B theory of time, to say that the universe began to exist, that the universe lived into being, it just means that the universe, so to speak, has a front edge. It would be like a meter stick, which has a beginning in the sense that there's a first centimeter or a first millimeter. The meter stick has a front edge, but the meter stick doesn't come into being at the first millimeter or centimeter. And so it seems to me that the truth of the first premise is all the more perspicuous and indeed, I think, unavoidable on an A theory of time. Now, that isn't to say that you couldn't defend that premise given a B theory of time. For example, Andrew Locke may be the person you're thinking of. He is a professor at the University of Hong Kong from Singapore. He's published on the Kalam cosmological argument. And in his version of the argument, he tries to show that even given the B theory of time, the argument is cogent. And I think it's certainly true that most B theorists would believe that whatever begins to exist has a cause. For example, if a horse began to exist at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in my living room, every B theorist would say there had to be a reason why that horse began to exist at 3 o'clock. It didn't exist at 2:59, and then it does exist at 3 o'clock. Now, remember, the horse doesn't come into being at 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock, 2:59, 3:01, all moments of time are equally real on the B theory. But nevertheless, if at 3 o'clock there is a horse in your living room that wasn't there a minute earlier, even the B theorist of time would say that horse has to have a cause. So while I think the first premise is virtually undeniable given an A theory of time, which I think is the correct theory of time, the argument can still be defended even given a B theory of time.
It's okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Craig. I'm very happy to see your answer to this. It's like saying that our meeting became our meeting here was started at for me it's 5 p.m.
Yes,
but in the B theory of time, it would happen at any time in the sense that it was happening yesterday. It will be happening tomorrow. In every time, there would be no exact point in time in which this meeting began. Is that a similar analogy?
No, let's be careful here. I want to correct you. That's not actually accurate. For the B theorist, the meeting begins at 3 o'clock, just as it does for the A theorist. The difference is that meeting at 3 o'clock exists there in a tenseless sense. It doesn't come into being at 5 o'clock. It's there no matter what time it is. If it's 2:58 at 3 o'clock, the meeting is there and begins. If it's 5 o'clock. If it's 6 o'clock, the meeting is there at 5 o'clock and the meeting begins. It never changes in that sense. It just exists tenselessly at 5 o'clock. But for the B theorist, as well as for the A theorist, the meeting does begin at 5 o'clock. And he would say, the B theorist would say, yes, of course there has to be a cause why the meeting began.
Okay. I kind of I was mistaken, but thank you
It's
for
very
this
subtle
correction.
and very
Yeah,
difficult to state.
very
And if
subtle.
you're interested in these questions, look at my book, Time and Eternity, which lays out these two competing theories of time and then assesses what implication this has for God's relationship to time.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Craig.
Saulo, has that book been translated to Portuguese? I know Time and Eternity is now translated to Spanish.
Yes.
Not yet.
Well-
In Portuguese, I don't think yet, but maybe soon, I believe. Maybe Dr. Craig has more information on that.
Well, I believe that it is published in one of those two languages. I don't remember which, but I believe it is out.
Well, I'm going to research right now, and I'm going to answer you right away.
Okay, thank you.
I must have it here. I think I have it before. Okay, I think Hob wanted to do another question. Go ahead, Hob.
Yes, actually, I was going to ask the same thing about this theory, but I have another question here. And this is about when you are talking about the Hilbert's hotel paradox, you sometimes find with the next objection. They say that paradoxical examples seeking to support causal finitism only prove that those scenarios are impossible, not that the actual infinity per se.
Can you repeat that again? I didn't quite catch that.
They say that paradoxical examples only prove that those scenarios are impossible, not that the actual infinity itself, because we do not know very well how the infinity is. So maybe in the future we will know how the actual infinity is and give valid examples, right?
Yeah. This is an objection that's simply based upon ignorance. The fact is that infinite set theory is one of the best understood branches of mathematics. And Hilbert was a mathematical genius who knew well how to illustrate the paradoxes of the actual infinite. And there's nothing about Hilbert's hotel that is peculiar to a hotel. In my own work, I used the library with books to make the same illustration. I've seen others use baseball cards or coins or eggs or beads. The type of object involved is irrelevant. And so the paradoxes are perfectly generalizable to apply to any actually infinite number of concrete things that you might think will exist.
Okay, I think you talk about this in your book Creatio ex nihilo. In the last part of the book, you talk about the set theory, and I think it's the same answer you just give right now. Thank you.
Yes, certainly.
All right, let's go with one of. I'm going to read two questions, the ones that were sent. First of all, there's a YouTuber in Spain that I believe his name is Quantum Fracture. And in one of his videos, he comments that scientists know that time did not begin to exist in the Standard Model or the Big Bang model. Is he correct on this?
No, he's quite incorrect. It's just universally believed that in the Standard Model, that time and space come into existence at the moment of the initial cosmological singularity. Neither time nor space can be continued through such a singularity. And therefore, it constitutes a boundary point to space and time. Think of a cone that goes back to a point. The point of the cone is a boundary point for that cone. You cannot continue the cone through that point. It is the boundary of the cone, and the geometry of space-time on the standard model is that of a cone. And therefore, the initial cosmological singularity represents the boundary of space and time. And you cannot have time before that. Now, the question that is a live question is the standard model correct? Cosmologists have been engaged in a search for models for decades now to try to subvert the prediction of the standard model of an absolute beginning. And so we've had one model after another proposed, attempting to avoid the prediction of an absolute beginning of the standard model. But as Alex Vilenkin has argued in numerous publications, none of these models is successful. We have no tenable model of a universe which is past eternal.
Next question from Antonio Mata. It says, Dr. Alex Malpass recently took the argument in favor of a finite past and applied them in such a way that they point to the necessity of a finite future. Usually, the asymmetry of the arguments is more of an epistemic nature and not metaphysical nature. Therefore, if the philosophical arguments in favor of a finite past are valid, it could be the case that the future is finite. That creates a problem for the notion of an eternal life within Christian theology. How can we respond to this?
I've responded to Alex's objection, which he borrowed from Wes Morriston, in two places. First, in the Festschrift for Alvin Plantinga, called 24 or so Arguments for God's Existence, edited by Jerry Walls and Trent Dougherty. That book surveys 24 or so arguments for God's existence, including the Kalam cosmological argument. And in that article, I sought to update the argument in light of all of the principal objections that I was aware of in the recent literature. And so I included this one from Wes Morriston and answered it. Then I had an interview with Cameron Bertuzzi on his podcast, Capturing Christianity, that featured both Alex Malpass and myself. And Alex and I had a dialogue about this objection, and I sought to show where he had erred. He was guilty, in fact, of committing a modal fallacy. That's a fallacy in the logic of possibility and necessity. Now, I understand that he has since tried to rehabilitate his argument and has published a further article, but I've not bothered to read that yet, and so I have no further response. I'm content with what I've already said. I don't think that the objection has any merit, and that given an A theory of time, it's perfectly coherent to say that while the past must be finite, the future cannot be actually infinite. The future can only be potentially infinite, which means that infinity is simply a limit toward which the future grows, but it never actually arrives there.
Okay, David, go ahead with your question.
Hello, Dr. Craig. It's a great honor to be with you again. I don't know if you remember that we have an interview in the past January about the importance of the church involving intellectually. It's a great honor to be with you again. And my question would be about one of the implications of the Kalam cosmological argument is that the cause of the universe should be personal, and that person should have a will. I was recently listening a debate in which the atheist part say that if the cause of the universe is a God that has a will, so why did God create the universe in the first place? Because it should imply that God had the desire to create the universe. So if God had the will and the desire to create the universe, it could be implied that he lacks something. And if God is lacking something in itself, so therefore, he cannot be a self-sufficient God. So how could you respond to that, Dr. Craig? Thank you in advance.
One thing that's important to notice about this, David, is that this is not a philosophical objection to the argument. This is a theological objection. The Kalam cosmological argument makes no pretense at all to prove that the cause of the beginning of the universe is perfect, either morally or in any other sense. So if it leads the question of the perfection of the personal creator of the universe an open question, that's just fine. That objection is a theological objection that therefore requires a theological response. And my theological response to that would be that from the Christian point of view, God does not need anything. He does not need to create. He does not need company. There is no need whatsoever in God of the universe. Therefore, the only reason for creating creatures would be for the benefit of the creatures themselves. He creates finite human persons in his image and invites them into the personal fellowship of the intertrinitarian persons. And so the tremendous privilege that God is offering us is fellowship in that intra-Trinitarian relationship that he has experienced from eternity. So not only is salvation by grace, but I believe that creation is solely by grace.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Does somebody else have another question that want to ask directly?
Yes, me, Raul.
Go ahead.
It's a little question, and the question is, what do you think, Dr. Craig, are the biggest challenges to the Kalam cosmological argument today?
I would say that with respect to the argument, the only hope of rebutting it would be to challenge the second premise, that the universe began to exist. I think anyone who denies the first premise just exposes his intellectual insincerity, because I do not think any rational person could deny that whatever begins to exist has a cause. So with respect to the philosophical arguments for the beginning of the universe, I think the best response would simply be to say, well, the actual infinite is really queer, isn't it? It's just bizarre, and that's just the way it is, so just live with it. With respect to the scientific evidence, I think that all the skeptic could do would be to hold out hope that in the future, as scientists probe more deeply into the history of the universe, that somehow they will be able to come up with a way of extending the physical universe to past infinity so that it did not begin. But so far, there is no indication that any such model is on the horizon.
Okay. So we're going to go to the fine-tuning argument questions. And I have one here from Joan Contreras from Colombia. And he says, Dr. Craig, the fine-tuning argument amongst cosmologists is understood as a neutral term or without any design implications. But many thinkers point out that the universe is finely tuned to permit life on Earth, but that it seems that quantum physics might present a problem to the fine-tuning of the universe because it would rather explain it on the basis of chaotic and unpredictable realities.
Mm-hmm. Now let's clarify for those who are not familiar with this argument what our questioner meant when he said it's a neutral term. The argument is not a neutral term. What he means is the term or the expression fine-tuning is neutral. It does not mean designed. What the word or expression fine-tuning means is that the fundamental constants and quantities that are necessary for life, intelligent life to exist anywhere in the cosmos, not just on Earth, but anywhere, have to fall within an extraordinarily narrow life-permitting range. So that if a dart were thrown randomly at the range of constants and quantities that could characterize the universe, the chances that it would hit the life-permitting range are just infinitesimal. And therefore, the fine-tuning of the universe cries out for some sort of explanation. Now, in fact, quantum physics won't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. On the contrary, some of the fine-tuning involves quantum physics. In the early history of the universe went through a series of what are called phase transitions. And in these phase transitions, which are governed by quantum physics, these finely tuned constants and quantities arrive at their values. And these would be, for example, the values of the fundamental forces of nature, like gravitation, the strong force, the weak force, and the electromagnetic force. And it seems just incredible that the universe could have gone through these phase transitions, and by chance alone, that these all fell into this almost infinitesimal life-permitting range. So the fine-tuning actually appeals to quantum physics, and some of the other examples of fine-tuning will involve quantum physics as well, like the standard model of particle physics. So it doesn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Our explanations are still going to be chance, physical necessity, or design.
All right, Saulo, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Unfortunately, before I make my question, time and eternity, unfortunately, there is no translation to Portuguese. So maybe there's an opportunity to translate it to Portuguese. My question, Dr. Craig, with regard to the fine-tuning argument, have you the fine-tuning argument today, as I understand it, is based on the narrow range of some constants and quantities on the physical level, but all of them are based on standard measures. I mean, the gravitational constant, for example, is a G, right? Its value is approximately 6.67 times 10 to the minus 11. And then there is some units used there, some physical units like newtons, meters, seconds, and so on. My question is there some development right now trying to argue for the fine-tuning of the universe, finding some quantities that are independent of physical quantities? I mean, is there any pure number that is not dependent, that does not depend on physical quantities to promote a fine-tuning argument? Are you aware of some development in this sense?
No, I'm not. The argument typically concerns these fundamental quantities and constants of nature. and how they fall into this narrow life permitting range. The only example that I could think of that wouldn't be like that, perhaps, would be the number of spatial dimensions. Many people have argued that only in a universe with 3 spatial dimensions would intelligent embodied life be physically possible. If you had fewer or more spatial dimensions, then this would be life prohibiting. And so I have seen an argument like that, and that seems to be rather different than the values of the constants and quantities, but that's the only one that I'm aware of.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to ask one of the questions that was sent from Sebastian from Argentina. And he says, sometimes some people present a dichotomy between design and the multiverse. Nevertheless, it has been said by some that even if there were a multiverse, one could argue design. Taken into account the most 2 popular theories like cosmic inflation and string theory, how could the previous claim be made?
The questioner is quite right about this. For example, the philosopher Michael Rota, R-O-T-A, Michael Rota, has argued that even given the existence of a multiverse, it still requires a cosmic designer. And Rota's argument, I think, is very persuasive. One way to show this would be to show that theories like cosmic inflation and string theory themselves require fine-tuning in order to be possible. The fine-tuning is sort of like that stubborn bump in the carpet. If you press it down at one place, it pops up somewhere else. And so even these physical theories designed to get rid of fine-tuning themselves require fine-tuning in order for those theories to work. Moreover, there is this problem that Roger Penrose has identified that I've spoken of with regard to using the multiverse as an explanation of fine-tuning. Namely, it turns out that if this multiverse is randomly ordered, then our existence is infinitesimally improbable. We ought not to be observing ordinary people like ourselves. We ought to be observing a world that is filled with so-called Boltzmann brains, with the illusion of an external world around them. And what Michael Rota argues is that the only way out of this is to say that the multiverse is not randomly ordered. Rather, there is an intelligent designer of the multiverse who has determined it in such a way that most of the universes in it are life permitting and are fine-tuned for the existence of ordinary observers like ourselves. So Rota turns Penrose's objection in a sense on its head and uses it to argue that there has to be an intelligent designer even given the existence of a multiverse.
Next question. It's before 1859, there were arguments in favor of design from biology. Nevertheless, when Darwin came into the picture, he stirred up the world with the current paradigm. Today, we are arguing in favor of design from the field of cosmology. And 2 questions come to mind. Is it possible that the Darwin of cosmology makes an appearance in the near future? And can we still make design arguments, but from the field of biology in a post-Darwin era?
Well, this is Richard Dawkins' hope, isn't it? The way he responds to the fine-tuning argument is to say, we hope that a Darwin will come along that will do for cosmology what Darwin did for biology. But while such a thing is always possible, there's absolutely no basis for thinking that that's the case. One of the disanalogies that I think is important to point out is that prior to Darwin's work, the origin of biologically complex life forms was a mystery. We just had very, very little understanding of it. There was scarcely any understanding of paleontology, much less genetics and so forth. By contrast, in contemporary cosmology, there's a very great deal of understanding of the universe and the way it works and of the laws of physics. So it's not like what Michael Behe called Darwin's black box. Contemporary cosmology has a good understanding of the universe, and it is precisely through the advance in the understanding of the universe that the fine-tuning was discovered. So from what I've read, it seems like a pretty good bet that even with the development of physics, that it's likely that the fine-tuning is here to stay for any future physics that might be developed. Now, as for a design argument in the field of biology, that's really not my expertise. I'll have to defer to people like Steve Meyer and Michael Behe and others who are working in that area. I must say I do find that the arguments against the explanatory adequacy of random mutation and natural selection seem to me to be pretty persuasive. As a layperson, they seem to be very persuasive arguments that this degree of biological complexity on this planet could not have been achieved in this amount of time simply through random mutation and natural selection. And so I think we can conclude that the contemporary theory of evolution still remains radically incomplete, and that therefore there certainly is room for a design argument.
Okay. David, go ahead.
Dr. Craig, George Smith, in his book Atheism, The Case Against God, makes a claim, maybe is of void value, but it's curious. He say that nature provides the basis of comparison by which we distinguish between design objects and natural objects. We are able to infer the presence of design only to the extent that the characteristics of an object differ from natural characteristics. Therefore, to claim that nature as a whole was designed is to destroy the basis by which we differentiate between artifacts and natural objects. How could you respond to that, Dr. Craig?
Well, I find that claim to be just obviously false. I think one of the strengths of intelligent design theorists like William Dembski is that we make these kinds of design inferences all the time in science and in other fields of life. Every time, for example, a cryptographer determines how to crack a code, and that he's not dealing with just random gibberish, but in fact an encrypted message, he makes a design inference. When insurance fraud investigators determine that a fire occurred by arson rather than by accident, he's making a design inference. When archaeologists determine that certain things found in the earth are in fact artifacts like tomahawk heads or arrowheads, rather than just random results of metamorphosis and sedimentation, he's making a design inference. When SETI investigators search the heavens for a message from extraterrestrial life, they know how to determine the difference between random noise and a message that exhibits the kind of specified complexity that would indicate information. So it seems to me that we make these sorts of design inferences all the time, and that therefore there's nothing threatening to natural reasoning in saying that we can infer from the fine-tuning of the universe that there is an intelligent designer who has set the constants and quantities of nature to be what they are.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Saulo, and I believe that will be our last question for today.
Yeah, thank you, Raul. Hi, Dr. Craig again. I'm besides being a Reasonable Faith chapter director here in Brazil, I'm also a intelligent design researcher here in Brazil alongside Marcos Eberlin. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's affiliated with Discovery Institutes, Discovery Institute also. And I have some of relationship with them also.
Good.
And I noticed that you used some of the same jargon that intelligent design researchers use, like specified complexity,
Right.
design inference. And I have a twofold question. The last time I entered and I visited the Discovery Institute website, I noticed that one of the fellows listed there is you. Your name appears there.
In the Discovery Institute, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm a fellow. I'm a fellow of the Discovery Institute.
Oh, very, very, very. I didn't know then. Since I followed their work since 2013, I believe, and just now I discovered that you were a fellow of the Discovery Institute. So I have been very amazed by this. What do you think is the proper relationship of the intelligent design research and natural theology? What do you think of this relationship that is very proper?
Okay, this is a very good question and would be probably the one reservation that I would have about the so-called intelligent design movement. I take it that what is distinctive about the intelligent design movement is that they believe that the design inference is part of science, that this is a scientific inference that one would make. As a philosopher, I'm more inclined to think of the design inference as a philosophical inference that is not part of the scientific theory. And that's why, for example, I've said that when I defend the Kalam cosmological argument, I am not offering a scientific theory in competition with the current cosmological models. Not at all. What I'm saying is that as a philosopher, when I think about these current cosmological models, I think that they imply that there is a transcendent personal creator of the universe. Similarly, when one reflects upon fine-tuning or biological complexity, I don't think we have to say that we are offering a competing scientific theory. Rather, what we can say is that given the scientific theories that are out there, they imply the existence of a designer of the universe who has set the quantities and constants, or who has guided the process of biological evolution to produce biological complexity. So that is my main reservation. The proponents of ID are very adamant in saying that the design inference is part of a rival scientific theory. And I think we are better advised to say, no, we're not in competition with modern science. We are making an inference, as you put it, an inference of natural theology, not science.
Thank you very much, Dr. Craig. I believe that alleviates me from some arguing with some people that I've encountered here in Brazil about intelligent design. Thank you very much.
Yes, my pleasure.
Okay, I believe we can wrap up with those questions. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Craig.
Certainly, Raul, I've enjoyed our time today. I tell you, if these questions are typical of the sort of work that our Reasonable Faith chapter directors are doing, then the people that you're ministering to are very well supplied and trained. And so I congratulate you on the job that you're doing and encourage you to keep at it. Trust the Lord for all the energy and might that he will inspire within you to make a great impact for him throughout Latin America.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. I really appreciate it. It means a lot coming from you.
Oh, thank you. I sincerely meant from the heart.